Welcome to the Pitching Command Show, brought to you by Command Trakker, the smart target that MLB and D1 teams rely upon to measure and train command. Many throw hard, but few command. Visit commandtrakker.com. 3, 2, 1. Hey, joining today's podcast is my friend Pat Robles, the Rehab pitching coach for the Astros. Welcome, Pat. I'm thrilled to have you on the show.
Hey, Wayne, thanks for having me on. Really appreciate it. Been looking, through your show for a little bit of time now, and you have some good stuff being brought on for sure.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, we really try to talk about other things than just throwing hard, and it's kind of hit a chord with a lot of people like that too. Um,
Absolutely.
you were a former college baseball player at Cedar Valley College and the University of Arkansas Pine Bluff and the University of Tennessee at Permian Basin. You were also the pitching coach at McCook Community College.
Yeah.
And then you worked as an analyst scout with the A's and then worked with the Phillies as the minor league pitching strategist. And now you're currently the Astros rehab pitching coach. Hey, that's some good experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that last one is University of Texas at Permian Basin. Everybody, it's okay. It's a small D2 college in Texas, but no, yeah, definitely a lot of experiences on the way. Obviously, playing college baseball, and then obviously being college coaching, getting into pro ball as well. Experience has been it's been awesome for sure. It's definitely baseball takes you on these different journeys and courses of life, obviously. So it's been great meeting a lot of people along the way as well.
And I always say I have a soft spot for community college and junior college coaches because my son went to a community college and it was the best thing for him. You know, he got some experience playing and going to school, and then he went on to DBU and then to the Yankees. So it was a great path for him. So I
Yeah.
always tell people, you don't have to just go to D1 right away. Going to a community college can be the best thing for a lot of people.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think it's like the development time that you have with each individual player is more along the line of what you're seeing in professional organizations. So I think you're seeing more guys that have obviously come through those ranks, the junior college ranks, into coaching, and then obviously into pro ball. So I think it's like more dedicated, detailed work to player development. So, um, like I said, just kind of aligns with how professional baseball is.
What is the main difference between a pitching coach and a rehab pitching coach?
Yeah, so the differences in terms of like overall development and development of strategies, and obviously the communication aspect is obviously similar to a pitching coach. The difference is obviously being in a team setting, right? Like ultimate goal is obviously you get up there, you compete with what you're developing, and on the rehab setting, it's more of it's a downtime. Obviously, mentally, it's a grind, but also it gives athletes the opportunity and chance to re-evolve themselves in terms of like getting some physical limitations fixed up, maybe some mechanical inefficiencies that kind of are being thrown there as well. I think it allows you to kind of be more set in terms of like a development, in terms of getting him back on the field, not only healthy, but also a way to like, how can we get him back healthy in a way of that he's better than what, pre-injury.
I've been looking forward to talking with you about using command in a rehab process as a tool, a metric, and a goal. Um, how have you used command in that setting?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously, around baseball, the things in terms of like max velocity is obviously still crucial, right? Like it plays a big role. I think
Yeah,
you're looking into it in terms of like command in a rehab setting with guys. I think it's big that you see kind of the adjustment in terms of like physical development, right? Or having the access in terms of like being able to use like wearable technology, being able to be on fields in terms of like biomechanics. So like being with Hawkeye, things like that, using with like Hawkeye biomechanics, and we're able to get some things that help us improve the things upon like the overall physical development of the pitcher. So I think like there's a lot of tools and settings that we can use in rehab to be able to like hone in on command a little bit more in terms of like we get guys maybe like that are pretty long loose levers, guys maybe that don't have the strength or stability to like consistently deliver it over the plate. I think that's one big thing in rehab where you're building your body in a way that allows you to move more efficiently and being able to like have dedicated like bullpen settings in rehab, right? Like one of the emphasis I've always done with rehab group, right? Because you're not really playing in games. It's a lot of bullpens, it's a lot of lives, and then it's obviously a build up progression. I think one of the things that keep you locked in is like obviously you're looking at individual like pitch development, pitch data stuff with each individual guy, and we're basically honing in on that in the bullpen, right? So like there's such thing as commanding to the top of the zone, right? Like pre 2K, and there's also something in terms of like expanding the zone on like 2K situations, right? So like guys can be really flourish of command. Like if I got a guy with a lot of pop on the fastball, basically, obviously, I'm gonna have a more command focus group with the guy that is maybe has some struggle with the fastball up at that top of the zone with the heater, having a bigger emphasis of like, okay, let's throw in some simulation with some live dummies, but also like let's have a big emphasis on getting that fastball to the top zone and then expanding once we get into a two strike. So it's like a simulated bullpen that we like to do with it because it gets competitive, but also we see some intensities that need to rise up in a rehab setting that we obviously need to hit before we can have the guy go into a game ready setting.
So they're pretty broad areas of command, right?
Correct.
It's not really like the command with my command tracker where you're hitting a spot. You're talking more about areas. Yeah. All right.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Because one of the things I always has come up was in baseball. There's a lot of slang. So when I say command, others people might say locating or might say executing or quality strikes, and those are all things of command. And then command has different levels of command: a small area, a big area, or like you're talking about upper areas or lower areas. When you're talking about command, how is like what's your areas that you're working with in a rehab setting? Is it really fine or is it just larger, like a third of the plate or that kind of area?
Yeah, I think it's like individually case basis, right? Like each individual guy has a unique ability to go to specific areas and locations. And then needless to say, like some guys too, right? Like maybe they're pushing something in terms of like a big sweeping slider, like they have really good command of that, right? So like we're now trying to get him where maybe he's throwing that pitch a little bit too much in the zone, and now we're working on things of like, okay, can we command this now to a greater area outside of the zone so we can now generalize locations to up maybe the chase or whip percentage of that pitch or what we're trying to do. Because if we see the movement profile shape out to be really good, obviously we want to expand that thing in terms of like getting it outside the zone, or like you do it vice versa, right? We get a guy that maybe has something in terms that is large that is getting commanding to a bigger area outside the zone. Now we want to generalize that to a smaller location. Well, when maybe we develop something in terms of something with a little bit more velo to the pitch, and that way we can now specify and get general locations a little bit smaller in terms of like more detail oriented in a pre 2K situation to that specific zone or location.
Yeah, so that's kind of like general command training.
Yeah.
I was talking to my friend Marty Egan at Iron Physio um, a few times about injury and fatigue and trying to detect that earlier by monitoring command. Like for example, if control starts to suffer, uh, you can tell if a guy is tired or there's some injury. And we were kind of wondering about we were talking about this. If maybe if you monitored command, could you detect injury or fatigue even earlier? Have you thought about that?
That's something that's very like broader out there in terms of like being able to generalize like where do injuries come from. Like we like to think, obviously, you look at things in terms of like in-game setting, looking at velos or maybe shapes of the pitch. Obviously, you can get a little bit more specific in terms of like either during the outing or like as the game is followed. You look at general like releases, like well, maybe this guy's like arm release height and side, maybe it was dropping as the course of the game was going on. So I think like it's going to be a little bit more broader in terms of like can we detail something to be like pinpoint, okay, like this is a specific reason why, this is like where the fatigue is finally settling in. I think like you could make the like claim that obviously control and command of the pitch of each pitch arsenal as he goes along is diminishing. Maybe we can look specific into like why is that actually happening. Maybe there needs to be some adjustment. I think you're just in an era where you got you can look at things in terms of a subjective view with video, but also like you can get more objective into like how each guy individually moves to like help enhance that in terms of like, okay, maybe it is a movement problem that we can help fix, and we can notify that because the command is diminishing and it's putting him in a very stressful situation in terms of like the arm angle kinematics. But I think like overall, just like generalizing like fatigue level, it's going to be pretty tough on that era. I think like maybe there'd be something like later on that can be developed in terms of that. But I think right now, like you can get objectivity and kind of like pinpoint things in terms of like movement inefficiency from your, biomechanical standpoints.
Yeah, because I was thinking like, if a guy is just having trouble throwing strikes, to me that's kind of later on in his injury or fatigue, like it's an indicator. So I was thinking, command. Well, if he lost the ability to command and it starts getting broader, where you now have loss of control, I was thinking, well, command might be a precursor to all of those.
Yeah.
So if he's not commanding like he normally does, then maybe there's something going on that a coach or a rehab coach can look at. Well, what's happening here?
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. I think you can like hit the nail on the head with a pinpoint like precursor, right? Like this is like uncharacteristic of him, right? Like he went
Yeah,
from a very like high walk rate for like past like two outings, like that is now being diminished either a good way or a bad way, like in terms of like it's going a little bit more. So I think you can look at that and be able to be more detail oriented of like what you're doing and specify like, okay, there is a deficiency like mechanical or like obviously big part is like mentally, like maybe just there's some things as well in there that could play along in terms of like knowing who you are as a pitcher. So I think the involvement of that can help with in terms of like looking into a precursor.
yeah. Because I was thinking, not so much in game, but I sell that command tracker target, and the idea was, I wondered if you could monitor a guy's command level in a bullpen session, say once a week. And then if you're monitoring his percentage of command, I was wondering whether if you saw a drop in command that you can have some indication that something is going on. It could be fatigue or injury, and maybe catch it earlier than when it gets to be worse when he has control issues. So, and it's not my area of expertise. So that's why I was asking my friend Marty Egan. I'm asking you as well as what you think of that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think like you could definitely use it as a precursor, like going in like fatigue levels. Like I think it can be built in terms of like you're looking at things from a command aspect in terms of like either sitting with him through a side and kind of watching it, obviously, and then getting more detailed of looking at again, there's wearable things in terms of like pulse, looking at arm speeds. I think you can like probably paint a pretty good picture in terms of like looking at that data set, but also looking at maybe the command of the bullpen and kind of get like a precursor of like, okay, maybe this is some settling in fatigue as like a return to throw in terms of like either TJ, shoulder, or whatever the shutdown may be. I think you can take a dive into it, look at it, and we can further now look at it and plan to be like, okay, we see some fatigue levels setting in from a velocity, but also a command aspect of it. Now you
Yeah,
can go in and maybe plan out a little bit better deload like kind of in there with the throwing program, right? So we're not
right.
basically having to throw aside just to throw aside just because we're trying to get him returned. We're also trying to get him returned to play better than what he was pre-injury, right? So I think that's the big thing with rehab. A lot of it is like, let's just get him back healthy. But obviously, there's a big emphasis now of like, okay, let's just not get him back healthy, but also get like, how can we get him back a little bit better? And then I think you look at those precursors with velocity and command and kind of detail like, okay, fatigue setting in. I can now set up this deload in this week.
After Tommy John surgery, what's the difference between throwing to get the new ligament in place and building volume for competition? Is there a line? Because, for example, my son just had Tommy John 4 months ago.
Mm-hmm.
He has great command. I think Fangraphs has him as number one in the Yankees for command, and that's because he's always thrown to a target, so he has great command.
Yeah.
So when he was warming up and getting throwing his throws, I noticed in a session that still has great command, even low volume throwing. And I was telling him, I think command is an indicator of whether his mechanics are right. So that if his command were off, something was not right with his mechanics. So to him, it's like use it as an indicator of whether your delivery is proper. Have you seen that kind of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. Especially coming back from like TJ, right? Like obviously you hadn't been throwing a baseball for a while. You're still trying to get full range of motion in terms of like the elbow, right? You're still trying to get that elbow extension to be fully extended. Um,
Well,
I
this
think
is past that point. So he's got full extension, everything's fine, throwing without pain, very easy. And
yeah,
so we were talking about throwing with command because if his mechanics are not right, you could re-injure yourself. And
yeah,
if your command is right, your mechanics are right. That's the idea.
yeah, absolutely. I'm more talk so like how that buildup goes in, right? Like there's a lot of factors, like obviously getting full ranges of motion, and then you're at that point of like your return to throw. I think you're having that emphasis of like not just being overall, I kinda can't get really dive into it, but, like, we do some really fascinating things in the rehab setting in terms of, like, not getting a subjective measure, but getting a more objective measurable. So, like, if you're throwing with velocity and having a specific target intention with your catch play in your throwing program, I think definitely for sure you're able to like sequence up a little bit more efficiently. You have now that external focus in your mind, right? So if I have more of
Right.
an external focus with my body, then my body and brain can now link up, and now I can go through a self organization, right? So now I can know, okay, my body now feels the rotation. It feels what it's like. I'm hitting that target more consistently now in throwing program with velocity. It just makes it now more reassurance of like, okay, I have two things that I now can have that more external focus with.
I had Bronson Arroyo on the show a few weeks ago. I don't know if you watched that episode. And what he was talking about was in his bullpens, he always threw soft first. So
Yeah.
even though he had a sinker that was around 90, he would try to throw it in the mid 80s or low 80s and build up to that, even in the bullpen. And he thought that was probably one of the reasons why he pitched 16 years in the big leagues because he kind of ramped up. And while he ramped up, he was still working on command. You know,
Yeah.
what do you think about that?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's times where like guys need to go through a more constraint movement pattern, like Bronson was explaining, right? You're putting yourself at a lower intensity levels to help fill like the movement out, right? So now I'm working in a setting of like now I'm thinking more consciousness with my thinking. I'm more self-aware of like what I need to do to achieve like the command or get the pitch to a specific location, and then you can help fill that movement, so then you move in towards more maybe later on like he was talking about, and now I get in terms of like a skill set mindset. So now I'm thinking more external factors. I'm now not thinking more conscious thinking. I'm more of an unconscious thinking because now
Yeah, yeah.
I'm trying to compete, right? There's specific things that you're doing as a pitcher now that is allowing to your body to move a little bit more freely now. So now that's kind of where the conscious versus unconscious thinking with your body kind of links up there. You get more of those external factors with after the buildup versus like you kind of need that point of what Bronson was talking about of like moving at lower intensities at first to now kind of link up what you're trying to achieve. And then as that throwing gets built up, now I can move to a setting where now I'm moving more freely.
Yeah. And like he was moving at lower intensities while maintaining command, as opposed to like I had Dan Hefner on the other day, and he was talking about when guys throw plyo balls, what he sees is that they're throwing it, they're releasing here. Whereas that if that were a ball, you would miss the catcher by 20 feet. So, he was talking about replicating kind of like the same action, but at lower intensity, you know?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you can replicate that. I think the big thing is like you're looking for that torso and arm connection, right? Like through ball release. I think it's very specific in terms of like commanding, but also think you can go a route of like being more generalized locations with plows, right? Like now you're throwing to a specific spot on the wall, where versus like maybe many guys fall along the lines of like I'm just throwing it just to throw it, just for a activation process of it. But you
Yeah,
also
you
can
probably
like,
you need,
yeah,
yeah, I think you need that too, right? Yeah.
yeah, you definitely need the activation process of it, but also you can get more specific in terms of like details, making sure you're like not doing obviously the movement pattern or the throw wrong, but also you're having more general like idea of locations of like, okay, now I'm getting more, eyesight. I'm getting a little bit more to the right side because now I'm more simulating of now my arm moving freely and having that connection through like my plow throw versus obviously that just regular activation portion.
Yeah. And even a simple thing like in catch play, um, if they're throwing to the torso between the belt and the chest, that's essentially a strike zone, pretty much. If they
Yeah.
use that as a strike zone. But in the early stages of war of getting back from injury, it's kind of a control. But I think that leads to command, and I think that if their mechanics are wrong, they're going to have trouble with that phase. You know.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, definitely. If your mechanics are a little bit off, which obviously to the start in a rehab setting, that's going to be a little bit just because you're now trying to retrain the movement patterns. But yeah, having a generalized, like obviously location of where you're throwing to target wise with velocity, I think is so crucial in terms of like how you're feeling as an athlete in terms of movement in a throwing program. So I think obviously that's where the majority of your practice goes. Obviously your side work, and then obviously your throwing program takes up probably about a large percentage of that, right? So
Mhm.
you can still work on throwing hard, but also throwing with command in your catch play setting, right? So like understanding like what intensities look like, how's that workload kind of built up in a rehab setting, so okay, I can move at lower intensities this day because I'm at a lower day, but I can still fill out how I'm moving, be more conscious of how I'm moving, but also like a general location of where I'm throwing to specifically in my throwing program.
I was talking to my friend Casey Mulholland. I don't know if you know him at Kinetic Pro,
Hmm.
and he makes that KP sleeve. Do you guys use anything similar?
No.
Well, how do you blend your skill work with monitoring workload then?
Yeah, so like we use Pulse. So I mean, I guess you could say it's pretty close, pretty specific, but like obviously we're using like Pulse with things. Obviously can't get into specifics of like how we're
Yeah.
using it. But I think like that's been the number one driver in terms of like workload management, right? Is through that Pulse outlook, understanding what chronic and acute is, right? Chronic being the built up over a long period of time, acute being the 1 day spikes that you're looking at. So I think like you can get real specific in terms of like managing built in, like right, like we talked about earlier, the precursor for command, right? I think you can look obviously at your data sets and be able to track like, okay, like these side days were on this week, these were pretty good intent, but obviously sub maximal in terms of like command. So like, okay, let's take a dive into it. Let's look at the data set as a whole through the week and be like, okay, we're maybe going at a little bit too higher intensities several times over the course of the week. So our cute's being built up a little bit too high. So then now we can know, okay, that's why the command maybe wasn't as spot on as he has been previously. So I think like you look at the specifics of workload management, and that obviously plays a big role that I've seen in rehab with guys being able to command it a little bit better as well. Is like if their workload has been managed better, you're seeing better in terms of
Yeah.
like commanding, obviously, and insides, and obviously when they get into lives.
Yeah, I can definitely see like monitoring the workload with velo and command, because those are two outputs, if you will. And you can see if the workload's too much, they'll both of those may suffer.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely, absolutely.
Now going on to a mental part, which is huge for rehab, I know.
Yeah.
Uh, I remember once when I first started, I was helping a community college with some pitchers, and the guy had Tommy John a few years before. Big guy, and wanted help to throw harder, right?
Hmm.
So I'm looking at his mechanics, slow motion video. I had some tips for him to do. And every time I suggested a correction, where his arm should be, where his leg should be, whatever it would be, that would fix and let him throw harder, he would change something else. So no matter what I suggested, get your arm here, get an arm here, then his leg would be in a different place. And I kind of concluded that he was afraid to throw hard. And so every suggestion I made, he would counter with a change of his own to make sure he was throwing slower. Have you run into that?
I say in the professional setting, you don't see it quite as often with guys that are like not scared to let it throw hard. I think we have to like in terms of like dial it back with guys in rehab setting is more like they're at a higher intensity. So now it's like, okay, this is where the velocity progression obviously has helped us in terms of like knowing which guy needs to know certain ranges for that day. So I think like you specifically can kind of dial a guy back a little bit, but I haven't had like many guys like go through the process of like, okay, like we need you to kind of like up the intensities in that setting. I think there is some specifics of guys that you do kind of have that hold back, and I think it's like a variety of mental things maybe that's going on with some guys. Like when you do see that, I think like it's the afraid of getting hurt, or it's even the afraid of like getting back into play, right? Like I think like a lot of guys that spend time in rehab or some are afraid to get back into play because the fear of like obviously roster sizes are shrinking up in professional baseball. So like how am I going to look when I get back into play and then I'm not basically throwing as hard or maybe or my stuff is not as good as the other guy, so I'm going to be the last man out standing. I think you can pinpoint it to a lot of different things, like obviously the mental grind of rehab. Like every day you're not coming in being part of the team, you're coming in here and you're working like throughout the whole day basically, right? It's like a training mindset, like you're basically still stuck in that off season mindset.
Yeah, I think mental focus and confidence are among the biggest factors in either rehab or command, velocity, everything. I have a saying I always use: thoughts become things.
Absolutely.
So what's going on in your mind is very important.
Absolutely.
Probably one of the bigger things that's important to a pitcher, I think, is what you mentioned earlier: is know who you are. Uh, Knowing who you are uh, and what makes you unique and special, I think is important too. Even for a rehab, if you continue to focus on what made you special before and continue that, because I think too often guys try to be somebody else, and that's not as a path for success.
Yeah, absolutely. I think like when you look into rehab and you think of like immediately maybe guys want to think like, okay, I got hurt because of X, Y, and Z reason, right? So let's take a look at it through a mechanical standpoint. Well, maybe not that maybe subjectively that gets him feeling at least good, but in terms of like you could see a drop off in performance, right, with that adjustment. So basically a player that has unique in terms of like hop setting, right? Like he's got good hop to the fastball. If there's some mechanical adjustment to get him feeling just good, in a sense or overall, I think it could be diminished in terms of like player development performance, right? Because like the ultimate goal is like still having that development piece of like, can you return him better than what he was before? And in terms of like looking at it through a pitch arsenal, obviously you got Hawkeye availability that we can take a dive into to understand of like how is that guy in terms of like if you made X, Y, and Z adjustment, how is that going to affect the arsenal as a whole? And I think it's even like that, right? With like scouting, you get guys that are so unique in college ball, and I think like you look at that their ability now, you get guys that have like the stuff and velo portion it, and maybe like they do need to work on that command setting side of it. So maybe it is a little bit more like timing or like small component of like mechanical inefficiency versus like in rehab you're getting a large broader ideas of like let's change this and that, and it's like, well, no, we can't, because as a rehab pitching coach you specifically like that would diminish the hop on the fastball or something.
Exactly. So the idea I was thinking about was guys might say, well, I was throwing this way and I got injured. So now in the rehab, I'm going to throw different so I don't get injured again. And it's like,
Yeah.
well, wait a minute. The reason you're in pro ball is because of some qualities you have. Don't erase those.
Absolutely.
Maybe find those inefficiencies that you mentioned and correct those.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, for pitchers that rehab successfully, what would you say that they have in common?
Yeah, I've been fortunate to be a lot of like really good rehab guys coming through. I think like the big thing in common, right, is like first off, like they know who they are, like as a pitcher, right? They know like what their stuff is, how unique they are. And I think like day to day grind, right? Like being able to sound like how to be a pro, right? You go in, like if it's a low day, like I know that maybe my main portion is in the recovery aspect. So maybe like I'm working on more of a mobility and stability day. So like, how does that day get attacked to better like my overall performance on the mound, right? Because that's a crucial day for the low day recovery, and it's just as crucial as like the high day, right, where you're actually throwing a side or you're doing like a little bit higher intent throwing. I think it's just it builds in into like that rehab setting for a pitcher of how am I going to act every single day to come in to be able to finish this product? So at the end of my rehab time, I'm better than what I was before. And I think that's what you see in terms of like guys that go through from the start to finish of rehab, like the special ones that you see come back is like their overall actions is like being a pro.
Yeah, that's very important. And like you said, I've seen too where, as you mentioned, guys trying to do too much. Like I've seen guys get setbacks where they'll do the rehab at the facility, then
Yeah.
they'll go home and to do some extra things. It's like, no, no, wait a minute. You should just do what the rehab pitching coach told you, no more, no less, because he's got a plan for you.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know. And now, for pitchers that have trouble with rehab, what would you say those guys have in common?
Yeah, I think again, like not knowing like attention to detail in terms of like their own program, like going off script of like have a low day, maybe you throw a little bit higher. That obviously rolls in the context, and then going into like overall day to day, like how you are in terms of like are you due diligence with your work, and then being a broader picture of like uh being more specific, like I'm not just checking a box to throw my side. I'm actually working on stuff, whether that be
Right.
shapes or locations. I think a more dedication to that in a rehab setting with your sides is very crucial, especially with the feedback because you're not playing in games at that point. So I think like how you go about your day in terms of like you see it go south when guys are just like checking a box, checking a box. Luckily, we hadn't have that down here. We do a really good job of like keeping a development focus while still being in rehab.
Yeah, I think sometimes if guys are remote rehabbing, they're not at the facility. They're doing an exercise or something that the coaches told to do. They may not be doing it correctly, as opposed to if you're sitting there with you and they're doing some exercise or some kind of routine,
Yeah,
you're going to make sure they get the most out of that routine because they're doing it the correct way. Like, for example, if you're doing a bicep curls, if you come up really quick, like there are different ways to do a bicep curl,
yeah,
depending on what you want to get out of that exercise. So, have you seen that kind of thing as well?
yeah,
Well,
yeah.
I guess you haven't because you're there with your guys and you're showing them the right way to do it.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. We're able to have the fortunate ability of like have breakdown in classroom settings in terms of like what the drill specific should look like, and obviously what pitch shapes or overall goals should look like from their individual standpoint. And so I think like we're able to build up enough like information for those guys and videos to be able to keep the dialect in terms of like when he does go home, he still doesn't miss a beat because we're still getting objectivity feedback to him, but also the subjective feedback when he's here to tie that in together to like help him in terms of like overall development.
Now, I have a thing I always do at the end of the show where I put 9 things up that I think every pitcher should have. And if they had all 9, you'd have like a Hall of Fame pitcher.
Yeah.
And I ask people if they'll please choose which 4 that they think are the most important. So I'm going to put those on the screen and I'm going to read them out for people who are only listening.
Okay.
They are character, command, changing speeds, movement, max velocity, sequencing, reading batters, mental toughness, and know who you are. So if you could pick four that are the most important to you as a rehab coach, maybe, you know?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. As far as a rehab setting, obviously, know who you are is pretty important up there for me. I think that's huge in a rehab setting to know who you are in terms of like overall stuff in arsenal, and obviously who you are as a pitcher. I would go number two would be max velocity. So I just think it's so overall importance for guys that build up from rehab setting to like how can we get them better overall. And then thirdly being command for me, obviously being able to have that ability of like commanding your stuff or where you're going through. And then fourth being obviously the movement. I would say, you know, three and four could be interchangeable in terms of command and movement. Because I think like obviously if you guy that can move the ball around pretty well, you can pitch to basically general locations or larger locations that can get swing and misses versus obviously being a command in a general, you actually know who you are and you're very specific to a location. You can basically you have the stuff and ability to like generalize that versus like a guy that's just maybe movement. You got larger movement areas. Maybe you still command it to the outer third pretty well with one specific pitch versus like same or opposite batter hand.
Yeah, I think that's huge. Knowing who you are and sticking to that. And for example, like we talked about earlier, that knowing what you do good and then working on to do that great, because
Absolutely.
that's why you went into pro ball. They saw something that you did that was unique, so develop that, you know. And I think
Absolutely.
in a rehab setting, to try to get that back, and you know,
Absolutely. Yeah. You got to have that ability to like get all that stuff back. Being able to like development while you're still being injured is like it's very crucial, right? Because that window closes, right? And I think like obviously in pro ball that years, you know, go on. It's like obviously there's more guys nowadays that throw really hard. You can find a bunch of them now, right? Versus like maybe back then you had a very like general like okay like this guy is the only one that throws pretty hard. So I think like you get it more emphasis on like being able to like search individually for each guy, like how they are specifically, and then pertain it to a rehab role of being like, okay, this is who you are, and how can we affect this to like, yes, maybe we do if a guy that lacks velocity, we have that increase, but also like, how can we now like develop a pitch, or how can we like develop command in terms of like being a be more specific, especially like an older guy, right? Like an older rehab guy. Like now you got to be more specific to these locations as you move up the levels because obviously the hitters are a little bit different. They're seeing spin a little bit more better. They're picking up in terms of like pitch tipping. So I think it's like different from a younger guy rehab where it's more like focus on the velocity and the overall development of stuff. Um, and then versus like the guy that's older, maybe his window's closing. Maybe he still does need that development of the pitch or the velocity to come back, but it's also like more specific in terms of like general command to help him put away hitters a little bit better in terms of like double A, triple A, or even the big league level.
yeah, I always have my saying. I say many throw hard, few command. You
Correct.
know, and I noticed years ago when I was using my pitch grader software that uh, as pitchers aged, I noticed that the velo went down and they still had good results. And I was trying to understand why that happened.
Yeah.
And it was because of a couple of things. Command. It was also because when I looked at their pitch arsenals, uh, each pitch was different enough from each other that even if they missed their spot, there was enough disruption of batter timing to get better results for them.
Yeah.
So I was trying to look at why does a guy like Adam Wainwright still do very well at the end of his career? Because they start learning about command, separating the pitches. They know how to read batters. And those
Absolutely.
are all the kind of things that we talk about on this show, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. I think like you have with older guys, if it's coming out all at the same release, I think it's just so crucial and how well they command it. Like now the hitter is reading it a little bit differently. Obviously, the hitter reads it a little bit differently than when it's coming out of the same release, especially with the guy that commands it. Now that's just a general term in terms of like using pitch tunneling, right? That's like the same specific thing when everything comes out of that same release. So I think you get guys that are older that can probably pitch a little bit longer because of that specific reason. Then obviously as well, maybe they do have something in terms of like separation of pitches on a pitch chart, which looks a lot better than maybe how well they're
Oh, yeah.
performing or how well they are performing is because of that specific reasons.
Yeah, because the days of just blowing a pitch by, guys, I think are pretty much gone. You have to pitch now. You have to mix pitches. You need movement, command,
Yeah,
sequencing. There's a lot of things. And I think in
absolutely.
rehab, in rehab, I would think you're trying to bring back the velo. I think you're
Hmm.
trying to bring back the movement. And I think you ought to be trying to bring back the command too.
Absolutely.
Like bring all those levers up, and
Absolutely. Yeah.
and then the mental part, I think, has got to be for rehab. The mental part, I'm thinking it's probably the number one thing, right?
Yeah. Yeah. The mental part is huge. It's huge. Yeah.
Yeah. Hey, well, Pat, it's been great having you on the show. I've been looking forward to this for a while. I know we had to
Absolutely.
reschedule a bunch of times, but
Yeah.
I'm really glad you came on. It's been a great show.
Absolutely. Thank you, Wayne. I appreciate it.
All right. Have a great day.
All righty. You too.
Bye-bye. Don't forget to hit subscribe to get notified when new episodes are released. Pitching Command Show, brought to you by Command Trakker, the smart target that MLB and D1 teams rely upon to measure and train command. Many throw hard, but few command. Visit commandtracker.com.